Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me for episode 17 of season 5 of Black Writers Read. My name is Nicole Young Martin, and I'm the founder, producer, and host for the series. I write to document the educational activist histories of community activists, politicians, and school university board members whose work focuses on the educational policy and process change making to affect social justice change within schools, colleges, and universities. I firmly believe that our knowledge of these histories will help guide practice, leading to better educational outcomes for all, especially Black students. These are the words offered by today's guest on Why She Writes. Today is International Women's Day, and I'm very excited to host today's conversation with our guest, whose book, ironically, comes at the right time. We were talking a little off air about this, to assist and guide us in necessary conversations that uplift Black women's leadership, civil rights, and policy change. And also, while we were talking, I learned that we have other intersections, including being at universities that had activists take on eliminating affirmative action and affirmative action programs in our respective states. So I'm extremely excited about this conversation. So let's go ahead and get started. Black Writers Read showcases, celebrates, and honors the words, work, and traditions of Black writers from across the country, across genres, across experiences, and across the African diaspora. Black Writers Read is a behind-the-scenes conversation into the craft and what it means to create as a Black author in today's society. Since starting the series during the summer of 2020, we've hosted over 80 authors representing 10 plus genres from 5 countries and 23 states. Our platform includes the live stream interviews, the audio podcasts, book clubs, and curriculum development assistance. Find us online at blackwritersread.com. Today, we welcome Dr. Donna J. Nicol to discuss her book, Black Woman on Board. Black Woman on Board, Claudia Hampton, the California State University, and the Fight to Save Affirmative Action examines the leadership strategies that Black women educators have employed as influential power brokers in predominantly white colleges and universities in the United States. Author Donna J. Nicol tells the extraordinary story of Dr. Claudia H. Hampton, the California State University system's first Black woman trustee, who later became the board's first woman chair, and her 20-year fight from 1974 to 1994 to increase access within the CSU system for historically marginalized and underrepresented groups. Amid a growing white backlash against changes brought on by the 1960s civil rights and Black Power movement, Nicol argues that Hampton enacted sly civility to persuade fellow trustees, CSU system officials, and state lawmakers to enforce federal and state affirmative action mandates. Black Woman on Board explores how Hampton methodologically, I can't pronounce that today, played the game of boardsmanship using the soft power she cultivated among her peers to remove barriers that might have impeded the implementation and expansion of affirmative action policies and programs. In illuminating the ways that Hampton transformed the CSU as the affirmative action trustee, this remarkable book makes an important contribution to the history of higher education and to the historiography of Black women's educational leadership in the post-civil rights era. Winner of the 2024 Best Indie Book Award in Nonfiction, History, Politics, and Social Sciences, Black Woman on Board offers a rare view inside the university boardroom, uncovering the vital role Black women educational leaders have played in ensuring access and equity for all. Dr. Donna J. Nicol is the Associate Dean for Personnel and Curriculum in the College of Liberal Arts at California State University, Long Beach. To learn more about Dr. Nicol and her work, please visit her website at donnajnicol.com. During our conversation and while she reads, I'll be sharing the link to her website and also how to find the book on Instagram. For those of you who are new to Black Writers Read, here's the format. Dr. Nicol will read an excerpt from her book, then I will come and we'll chat. If time remains at the end of our conversation, we'll open it up to Q&A with those who are joining us today. We typically have viewers joining us from Facebook and YouTube. If you have a question, please feel free to include it in the comment section on the platform you are joining us from today. I will compile the questions and either pose them to our guests following our conversation or insert them during an appropriate time within our chat. So, this book, I need to preface, it came out in 2024. I feel like I could not have forecasted hosting this book at this particular time. I have a question later on for our guest about the life that this book has taken on in the current political, societal, economic, and policy morphing process. So I could not have thought of a better way to acknowledge International Women's Day. So I'd now like to welcome Dr. Nicol to the virtual stage.
Hello
Hello.
there. Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Happy International Women's Day.
Yes, happy International Women's Day. And I could not. Oh, I'm so excited to talk about this book, especially one, the realm in which the book was written, but also two, how it's taken on another life given the circumstances that we currently exist in. And
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much for being here, also for writing this book, and also to incorporating this work into your scholarship, given where you live within the Ivory Tower. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited, looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so definitely go ahead and read, which I'm really excited for folks to hear an excerpt from the book. And while you're chatting, I will share the link to your website and also to your Instagram. So happy reading.
All right, thank you. So I'm reading from chapter 3 in the book. The chapter is entitled The Conciliator Makes Dinner. Hampton strategically disarmed the threat posed by her race by playing to the gender norm, using sly civility and respectability as resistance tools. In the early years of her appointment, Claudia Hampton used charm and wits to influence her colleagues to side with her position when it came to selecting presidents or voting on resolutions, because for the first few years, Hampton was closed out of the telephone network. She says, quote, "It was years before I became part of the telephone network. For several years, 3 or 4, I didn't hear from anybody from July to September. The telephone network was an informal system where the trustees would discuss upcoming votes before board meetings, using this informal time to count votes before the next meeting. The telephone network utilized phone calls and in-person meetings to discuss board business outside of the normal board meeting times. Since Hampton did not know anyone on the board prior to her appointment, she was not granted access to this network for several years and often had to make her case during board meetings that were so structured that it was often difficult to discuss any particular issue at length. After observing the meeting structure and how her fellow trustees conducted themselves during these meetings, she decided she needed to find a way to become more of a participant rather than as a mere observer. Quote, "I dare say the first board meetings I went to, I never opened my mouth. But eventually I said, well, I'm here for 8 years. I must be here for a reason. Somebody thought I should be there, and I really got to get into this thing and participate," end quote. Hampton figured out quickly that she needed to trade votes to gain some favor with trustees with whom she disagreed politically to gain access to the telephone network. For example, Charles Luckman, the trustee with whom Hampton traded chits to get the votes needed for Donald Girth to become the president at California State University, Dominguez Hills, had considerable influence on the board. A Pat Brown appointee who was decidedly conservative in his politics, Luckman derived much of his power on the board due to his success as a businessman and an architect responsible for designing some of the nation's most iconic structures, including Madison Square Garden in New York City and the Prudential Tower in Boston. He was one of the original trustees appointed in 1960, meaning that those appointed after him often deferred to his knowledge of the system's inner workings. Luckman had also served on the board for 22 years, longer than any other trustee to date. So Hampton knew it was vital to gain Luckman's favor because he was so influential, well liked, and respected. Donald Girth said, quote, "Claudia was able to work with all of these people," when speaking about Hampton's relationship with powerful trustees like Luckman, governors, and chancellors. Hampton's success in convincing her fellow trustees that she was a political moderate, even though she vigorously championed affirmative action, helped her eventually gain access to the network. which was generally reserved for more experienced white male members of the board. After she was accepted into this informal network, Hampton's influence and power on the board grew considerably. For example, Hampton could easily gain support for affirmative action because she had already discussed her position and was able to change someone's mind during the telephone network process. Once Hampton was accepted into the fold, the in-person telephone network meetings often took place at Hampton's home in Los Angeles, where she became hostess, preparing a meal and entertaining a select group of trustees and campus presidents. Herb Carter says that days before hosting the telephone network meetings, he and Hampton would meet at her house to plan and strategize before she made dinner for the white trustee colleagues. Quote, "We would sit there and drink wine, smoke and drink. That's how she kind of ran stuff in the board," end quote. Hampton continued hosting the telephone network for several years after she was appointed board chair. Donald Girth recalls that sometime in the mid-1980s, I remember going to Claudia's house. Well, I remember one time I brought 3 or 4 presidents with me, including Jim Cleary, Ellis McCoon, and a couple of others, to her house, where we talked about settling some disputes with Ann Reynolds, who was chancellor at the time. Playing hostess was one surefire way that Hampton could participate as a full member of the network while playing to the gender norm of the day. Nothing in the historical record indicates that Hampton was asked to host these meetings by her white male peers. Instead, Hampton and other Black women like her, who had to work with white men to secure opportunities and resources for their communities, often volunteered and placed themselves in situations where they could influence their peers in a less formal work setting. As an example, Verna Canson recalls on 2 separate occasions that she and Claudia Hampton hosted parties in honor of Alex Sheriffs when he left the Reagan administration before joining the California State University's chancellor's office. We had a party for Alex at my house. My husband cooked steaks and stuff. We had a great time. There was a later party which Claudia gave. It was very interesting. There's a science to that. Here, Canson is referring to the science of informal social networking with someone with whom you might not have much in common politically, but you can have a good time together socially. Herb Carter even recalled Hampton going for beers and cigarettes with individual trustees after board meetings. This type of hosting and socializing gave Black women a unique opportunity to potentially develop lasting friendships with their white peers, which could help influence their votes on issues of importance to these women. Thus, it was a stroke of genius for Hampton to engage in this type of sly civility behavior, because she could downplay the threat posed by her race, since she was not challenging the status quo regarding her gender. Hampton was likely to have advanced much further in her role as a Black woman than if a Black man had served, because her gender posed no threat to the majority white male board. Serving as a hostess in this regard allowed Hampton to play the long game of boardsmanship, because she could disarm some of the racial hostility that she encountered had she presented herself as a staunch feminist. This point is made clear by Hampton's assessment of how the board members regarded other women who came after her. She noted that despite being the affirmative action trustee, she was not regarded as narrow-minded in that respect, like some of her white female counterparts. She says, quote, "We had 2 other women. Both were viewed as having tunnel vision. In one case, I think it's more accurate than the other. One of the things they say to me is that I'm all over the territory, but I defend affirmative action. And there are other very strong supporters of affirmative action on the board, but some of them seem to just have an interest in women's issues in certain aspects of affirmative action. I try to be attentive to anything having to do with affirmative action, but I have never, to my knowledge, have been criticized for being a one-issue trustee." This assessment of how other women on the board is revealing, because it shows how Hampton's efforts at using charm, wit, and even hosting fellow trustees at her home gave her more political and social capital to defend the issue she cared for most deeply. At the same time, it also demonstrates the unwillingness of her white male colleagues to take seriously the issue of gender discrimination when addressed by white women trustees. Note the irony that a Black woman had more influence regarding board decisions than her white female counterparts because she played to the gender norm instead of seeking to disrupt it. It's also important to note that Hampton had to earn her access onto the telephone network, which explains why she had to spend time building capital, as she had realized early that she could not address both race and gender simultaneously until she had enough power and influence to do so. Even before she could come into her own type of power on the board, the reality was that typically women of color are required to choose one identity over the other or risk not being taken seriously. Legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw describes this phenomenon as political intersectionality, which highlights the fact that women of color are situated within at least two subordinated groups that frequently pursue conflicting political agendas. The need to split one's political energies between two sometimes opposing groups is a dimension of intersectional disempowerment that men of color and white women seldom confront. Black women, like Hampton, must therefore calculate which identities they will emphasize and prioritize in order to be effective in a white male-dominated arena, such as corporate and university boards. Even when Black women are victims of racial and gender discrimination, the United States Supreme Court has a record of forcing these women to pick an injury. That is, one cannot seek redress for racial and gender discrimination simultaneously. The landmark Supreme Court decision in Vinson versus Meritor Savings Bank in 1986, which recognizes sexual harassment as a violation of the Civil Rights Act, provides the clearest example of the court's failure to recognize how both race and gender shape Black and other women of color's experience with discrimination. Michelle Vinson, a Black woman, had been subjected to 3 years of reoccurring sexual harassment by her supervisor, Sidney Taylor, when she worked at the bank as a bank teller at Capital City Federal Savings and Loan, which later changed its name to Meritor Savings Bank in Washington, D.C. In 1978, Vinson was fired from her job for excessive use of sick leave, which Vinson testified was taken because of the physical and psychological trauma she endured by being forced to have sex with Taylor at work, including his touching her in public, exposing himself to her, and forcibly raping her multiple times. Vinson attempted to report Taylor's harassment to company officials early on when the harassment began. However, she was told that she could only file a complaint based on race, though they advised her it would be difficult for her to get a ruling in her favor since Taylor had never been cited for racial discrimination before. After she was fired and Vinson sought legal help, several lower courts ruled against her, stating that she could not prove she was a victim of racial discrimination as defined by Title VII, I'm sorry. Even when the case finally made its way to the Supreme Court and the justices agreed she was subjected to a hostile work environment, she had to decide whether she would pursue the case on the basis of race or gender, not both. Since race was clearly defined as a protected class, Vinson and her legal team sought redress for gender discrimination. In a 9-0 decision, the case made sexual harassment in the workplace an illegal form of discrimination for the first time. Not only did this landmark case help to define sexual harassment for the first time, it also highlighted the need for the legal profession to grapple with its short-sightedness regarding Black women's experiences as women and as people of color. Thus, Crenshaw's work on intersectionality and Adrienne Wing's work on critical race feminism provides an important corrective to this oversight. Unfortunately, Black women and other women of color continue to encounter intersectional oppression in the workplace, in social justice organizations in which they belong, and in their choice of politicians that represent them. Despite the number of academic, political, and social organizations which address these intersections have grown substantially in recent years, most places where these women must work and try to make change still do not fully recognize or understand what it means to embody multiple intersecting identities. Therefore, Claudia Hampton's choice to play to the gender norm in her early years on the board to avoid and disarm potential racial tensions due to her race clearly demonstrates how she utilized sly civility as an approach to great effect, despite many of her contemporaries on the board and those among the chancellor's office staff voicing misgivings about affirmative action. Thanks.
Thank you so much for reading that particular section, Dr. Nicol, because I think it helps give a great overview to folks who are watching and will be listening what the book is about, but also it really helps to frame why this book is, I feel like, even more relevant now than it was when it first came out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I see the direct line, you know, that in this current moment, given everything that's going on, you know, we need a strategy for making sure we attend to both race and gender. Because I think what's happened is in all of this conversation about woke and anti-DEI, people think to decouple race and gender from DEI, but DEI is expansive. You know, it includes gender, it includes ability or disability, it includes all of those things. But we've kind of, well, not me and not you, but, you know, powers that be have decided to make this solely about race. If you look at the Dear Colleague letter that came out from the Department of Education, you know, it's very narrowly focused on race, and it excludes the experiences of women and you know, LGBTQ folks, you know, with this subtext like people of color are the enemy to, you know, to society. And it's like, this feels like a distraction. Like we're going to distract people from the fact that the federal government is, it feels like it's kind of engaged in grift.
Yes. And like what makes me, every single time I see DEI on any of those folks' social media posts, I get enraged because I'm like, do you even know what the acronym means? I teach a class in the fall, Cultural Equity in the Arts, where anti-racism is such a small part of the conversation. We talk about different leadership models. We talk about decision-making processes. We talk about policy making to ensure inclusion and belonging. We talk about like all of the isms. And also too, like my students were very surprised, like how in the arts, disability is still a new conversation. Like when I said to them, I was like, the first wheelchair bound actor was not on Broadway for the first time until maybe like 7 or 8 years ago. And so we are so behind when it comes to any community that is not cishet white male.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, I like to say anybody who can kind of put white and straight in front of, you know, at the front, they're leaps and bounds ahead of everyone else in terms of having access to rights and the presumption of competence.
Yeah. Oh, it's all competence. That's a whole other that's a whole other podcast episode. So I want to start off with our first question. I would love to hear about the origin story of Black Women on Board and well, why this book last year?
Yeah, why this book last year? So, you know, this has been a long project. I say it kind of builds off of work that I had been doing when I was even in undergrad, and you know, that was a long time ago. But I kind of discovered Claudia Hampton when I was getting ready to start doing some work on a piece to memorialize the work that my grandmother did to help create the first food co-ops in Watts after the Watts riots. And I just happened to go through a photo archive and I kind of discovered this picture of a Black woman in regalia. And then, you know, it said 1976, Claudia Hampton trustee Claudia Hampton appointed by Ronald Reagan. And I said, that Ronald Reagan? What? I was stunned because I had written about Ronald Reagan in my dissertation on conservative philanthropy used to get rid of Black Studies program and what he did as governor in the state of California to deal with protesters at San Francisco State University. So I was really just stunned by that discovery. And so that's kind of how the book kind of got started. I was like writing a book about my grandmother and just stumbled across this photograph. And it took me some time to, I was at another institution. I was at Cal State Fullerton at the time. And I remember the Cal States were going through budget cuts. So the archives weren't open every day. So I had to like kind of struggle to get into the archive. But when I finally did get into the archive, I realized there was actually quite a bit about Claudia Hampton and her contributions to the board. No one had actually gone through those archives. I was really one of the first who've actually gone through the whole thing. So the book kind of took some ebbs and flows because I moved jobs, but also I was raised in a Black radical tradition. And Claudia Hampton is not professing Black radicalism. Her politics and my politics are like night and day. And I said, oh, I don't know if I can, where I'm reading about the scene where she's cooking dinner for these white men. And when I heard an audio of her saying this, I said, oh, sis, no. Oh, it's like, she said, what? She did what? And there were a couple other points where she said that she was against collective bargaining for faculty. And I said, and I'm faculty at the time, so I'm appalled by it. And I stopped the cassette right there. And I walked away from the project for 6 months because I did not have any kind of language to kind of deal with to explain what was going on there. And so the book, I had to learn to not be intolerant. So I'm learning lessons as I'm listening to the audio and I'm looking at these archives. And I learned, when I went back to the cassette, that if I had listened just a little bit further, she had said, I don't support collective bargaining for faculty without guarantees for affirmative action protections. I had missed all of that because I was using my politics to judge her. So I got humbled and I went back to the archive like 6 months later and said, okay, I found some language to explain what she was doing. And ironically, I went back to some grad school, methodology stuff that I had learned on, because I took a cultural studies and education course on Homi Bhabha and the idea of sly civility. And that really is what transformed this project.
Can you share with folks, because I did have a chance to read the chapter on sly civility, can you share with folks what sly civility is?
Yeah, so sly civility is a resistance strategy. It's one of 3 resistance strategies that Homi Bhabha comes up with in his book, Location of Culture. And so there's hybridity, mimicry, and sly civility. And so he's talking about Indians in India when the British, come in to colonize. And he's saying there's 3 approaches that you can take. You can mimic the British and try to be just like them. You can become a hybrid where you take some of the good aspects of like British life or British culture and mix that with your Indian, like Indian culture. Or you can do sly civility where you pretend to be civil with your colonial masters so that you can learn about their opportunities and resources, and then you can pass those resources onto your community. So you're using civility in such a way where they think that you're safe, but they don't know that they, meaning the colonizer, does not know that you're really trying to undermine them from within and that you're trying to make a space for your people to benefit from all of the trappings that the colonists have. And so civility is it's a kind of pragmatic approach to resistance. It's not radical at all, but it is strategic. It's very, very strategic.
So I wonder if I've been doing civility most of my career, because I'm somebody who I will befriend a lot. Like how I used to call it, I would find the golden child in the organization. I would befriend them and ask them questions about how to navigate things. And also people say, and I'm originally from Detroit, and I come from a very radical tradition of union workers and union leaders. And like they say, Nicole, you talk white. And I'm like, there's a reason, and I hate that term, but it's like, I've been able to be a part of some interesting conversations, especially because I worked in philanthropy for a little bit, where I got to really hear white people with money and power and how they make their decisions. Because I feel like if I were very radical, which I know there is a space for that and that's important, I wouldn't have been allowed into a lot of those spaces. So I'm like, I need to read more civility because I think I've been doing it for a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, I didn't really like Homie Baba when I was in grad school. Obviously, look at my politics, but also, he's a little verbose and a little wordy, or yeah. But when I was at a conference, and they were talking about how HBCU fund development officers use civility to court white donors.
Yep.
And as soon as they said it, I said, I remember this. This is the one part of that pragmatic or practical type of resistance I could get with. And so, yeah, Claudia Hampton really kind of models this idea of, code switching in the workplace in order to advance the agenda for Black folks, for women, for low income students. And so I think what you're saying makes complete sense, that yes, you need people on the outside, the radicals, to raise the consciousness of the people, but you need people on the inside who can turn that into policy and concrete resources. And sometimes that is going to require you to speak to the people who have the power or have the resources in ways that is not like bashing them over the head and saying, you owe us this type of stuff, because you'll shut them down and they won't give you anything. But if you talk to them in a way that suggests some kind of collaboration or something like that, you'll be more successful.
And this is also too why I'm so glad, which I hope to get a chance to chat with you more. Why I'm so glad that a lot of your research was started in student activism. When I worked at UMass Amherst and I was an administrator, I was staff there for about like 10 years. And some of that time I was in student activities. And I just remember like watching some of the student protests and which movements got into the trustees meeting, which ones got a meeting with the chancellor, which, and it was just so interesting to see how all of that was navigated. And then also talk, like literally students would come to my office and be like, Nicole, why can't I get this meeting? Blah, blah. And I'm like, you need to learn how to speak the master's language, unfortunately. So
yeah. There's a kind of pragmatism tradition that kind of runs throughout black women have really figured out how to be, what do they call it, pragmatic and idealist at the same time. That you can have your goals are the long-term idealist goals, but you have to make some short-term pragmatic smaller goals. And sometimes that is going to require you to speak to people differently depending on the audience, and I would have students, I had the same issue. And I had to learn it as a student activist, because I was ready to, bum rush the president's office too. And then it was just like, yeah, but I don't want to be hog tied up out of here. And then the movement dies out because you don't have anyone championing anymore, because everybody's like, oh, we could dismiss her because she's they're behaving like thugs or whatever. So I would often have students, and I'd have to say to them, like, first of all, you need to narrow down your list of priorities. You got to list 10 things on this list, and they're going to give you the lowest hanging fruit every time. So if your priority is to increase the number of Black students admitted to the university, why do you have let's have a Black student living learning hall, and if that's not your priority, don't ask for that. Ask for, narrow your list down to 3 things instead of 10. Stop being a liberal and be more conservative. No,
Yeah, right.
it's kind of true. But also, how can you make them understand on a kind of personal level why this is important, as opposed to bashing them over the head with why it's important? Like, kind of, can you find a middle ground? Can you develop a friendship almost in order so that you're heard, as opposed to being dismissed for being the angry Black student?
So, for folks who are unaware, can you share what the roles are for members of a board of trustees in higher education? Because when we talked off air, we talked about our experiences with working in these institutions, these people holding huge amounts of power, yet no one really understands how they function. So for folks who are unaware, can you share what the roles are for members of boards of trustees in higher education, and offer an overview of the circumstances, climate, and environment that would have existed for Dr. Hampton while serving in this capacity?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, simply put, trustees, boards of regents, boards of governors, and so forth, they have different names, different iterations, but they all are principally responsible for oversight into the day-to-day operations of campuses or universities. And what I mean by oversight is, really, they're supposed to protect the public interest. So particularly with publicly funded universities, where taxpayer dollars are being used to help subsidize these institutions, they've agreed, these institutions have agreed to have a board of trustees, monitor their funding, any kind of building projects, and so forth. And so the trustees actually have oversight. They can cancel a program. They are responsible for the hiring and firing of every member of the university. Often they don't do the firing, but they have the power to. They can make tenure decisions on faculty cases, and they're very invisible to the average person. Most of us don't know who our board members are, what their politics are when they come in. How they even got to the board is a mystery for a lot of people. And then how they can sway not only what happens on campus, but what can happen in the legislature. They also have that ability as well. So to give you an example of how much power they have, in the California State University system, when Claudia Hampton first came into the board, so she came in 1974, the California state system did not have an official non-discrimination policy, let alone an affirmative action policy, in 1974. And they were out of compliance with federal law that said you need to have a non-discrimination policy, which says you can't bar someone because of their race, their gender, national origin, and so forth. So shortly after Hampton got onto the board, the California State University system said, "Oh, we better do this because we want those federal Higher Education Act dollars, the TRIO grants and all of those things." But when I was going through the archives, I was reading notes, sidebar notes that were added, and folks would say things like, "Well, what about the rights of the majority?" It's like, wait, what? What are you talking about? So they did not want to comply with this federal non-discrimination policy, but because they needed the money from the feds to keep the institutions going or to be in compliance, they went ahead and finally got an not affirmative action, a non-discrimination policy. Now, when it came to affirmative action itself, so you have to have non-discrimination in order to get affirmative action. When it came to affirmative action for student admissions, California did not get into this. The California State University system didn't get into compliance until 1980. So, you have the Johnson administration that says that we have affirmative action in 1965. 2 years later, white women press and say gender needs to be added to this executive order, and it was added. 1972, the federal government said, all of you universities are out of compliance. We're going to take your financial aid away. And that's when most trustees decide, oh, we better comply. But they have also decided they could drag their feet. And so in the case of California, they said, well, we'll give you 6 years to get into compliance with federal law. It's like, why is it taking you so long? But because they didn't want to bring in students of color, and so they took a long time to get things passed. So it took an assembly concurrent resolution. So the state actually had to force the trustees to do a lot of these things. And then when the when the legislature wants to pass an education bill, they come and get the advice of the trustees and their endorsement. So it's this weird reciprocal relationship where the state government depends on the trustees depend on the state government, and nobody talks to the public. And so a lot of things are done without the public's being aware. Now, the public can go to some of these meetings, but the committee meetings are often closed door, particularly anything that has to do with personnel and collective bargaining. So they have a lot of power. They can, if they didn't like, and there were cases of this in this Cal State system, if they didn't like a particular op-ed by a student newspaper, they could take away all that funding. And so they had that kind of control and power. When Hampton came in the 70s, you had the Black student protests to create the first Black Studies program at San Francisco State. You had the Mexican American student uprisings in East LA that eventually gives way to Chicano studies. You have all of these things that have happened before Hampton comes on board, and you would think, okay, everything should be cool by now, right? We got through the 60s, we're in mid 70s, everything should be fine. No, these folks are mad that they have to implement affirmative action. And Hampton is what she's principally responsible for is the implementation of affirmative action. Passing the law was easy. Implementing it is a whole nother matter. And so she shepherded through affirmative action to make sure it got the funding that it needed, to make sure it was monitored, make sure they didn't write out, making sure that they attended to race and gender in hiring faculty, staff, and administrators. So the political climate was a tough one for her to navigate, especially since she was the first Black woman. There was a Black man before her. His name was Edward Lee, but Edward Lee didn't have a lot of wiggle room, and he didn't stay on the board long. She was reappointed by 4 governors.
Wow. I didn't realize that time span she would have had to advocate while there were like 4 different governors. That speaks volumes to the type of work that she was able to do.
Yeah. I mean, and she was reappointed by 3 Republicans.
Wow.
Ronald Reagan, George Deukmejian, and Pete Wilson. The only Democrat in there was Jerry Brown, and he was not necessarily a friend to affirmative action either.
And also, too, thank you, Dr. Nicol, for also talking about like the ways in which the public can engage or cannot engage with board of trustees and regents, which I love that there's the FAFO moment that's happening right now where I love watching these videos where people in the states that went red this past presidential election, and they're talking with their elected legislators, and they try to ask questions about like why he who shall not be named has not held his promises or why certain things are happening. And then the minute the politician starts speaking, I hear like the boos. And there was one, I gotta find it. Oh my gosh, this one woman, she literally wanted to make sure that her boo was heard. She stopped and she waited until it got really quiet and she went, boo! And I was like, yes! Like, I love this man. I love too, like, the town hall meetings have been packed. I can't remember where it was where there were like over 1,000 people showed up. And I love how it went from nobody going to these meetings to everybody going to these meetings. Something that I keep telling myself, I'm like, I'm trying to look at the optimistic side of what's happening right now in the country. And what I hope happens is there is this re-engagement with civics. And I have this conversation with my students a lot, even though I teach English, humanities, critical thinking, and arts management. I remember one of the programs I teach for is a Bard micro college, which is a subset of the Bard Prison Initiative and what we call Big Bard in Annandale and Hudson. And it's a community-based program that works with women who were young mothers. And I remember hearing from them a couple of election cycles. One of them was several major elections in the city where we were based, and then the presidential election. And so many of them, and they're predominantly women of color from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. I'm not registered to vote. I was like, okay. I said to them, I was like, I'm about to take my professor cap off and I'm about to go rogue. Like, what do you mean you're not? And they're like, well, we didn't have civics class and all sort of stuff. And I'm just like, okay, let me just breathe. And so now I can definitely say my students are really interested in learning more and trying to understand why certain things were taken away from us. And I'm like, they prepared, and hopefully I'm not rambling, but I'm like, the government has prepared us for this moment. The more that they uneducated us, the more it prepared us to be taken over in this dictatorship.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the racial dog whistling that makes people I had students in my Black movements of the 60s class, Black students who are like, Dr. Nicol, we don't know what affirmative action is. I'm like, wait, what? You know, and then I had another one admit to me, I always thought it was bad. Everything I heard about it, affirmative action, was bad. And I said, what? That and I said, where did you hear? He's like, well, you know, the TV, everything that's on television was kind of pointing in that direction, particularly in California when we were trying to get affirmative action back we were trying to bring it back after getting rid of it with Prop 209. We were trying to get it back. And I said, so you voted against it? And he said, yeah, because I didn't know this history that you're telling me about it. I didn't know how it probably would have helped me, you know, get into these kind of college prep programs and things like that. And so, yeah, the level of civic disengagement is breathtaking to me. And the kind of willful ignorance that kind of comes with that until you have the FAFO moments. You know, it's like experience is the best teacher, I guess.
The 5 whole moments, oh my gosh, which I'm really interested to see how the rest of the month is going to unfold, especially with grocery prices continuing to go up, the stock market continuing to fall, and so many people getting fired. And I'm just like, the 100 days, we're not even, I think we're halfway through. So I'm just like,
yeah, it's tough. And it's tough. I think it's also tough to kind of sit back. You know, I know that, you know, like we're the 92% and you know, the 88% Black men. We're kind of sitting back, kind of like my sister like said, we're sitting in the cut watching them and trying to figure out, how much worse this is going to get for us, because we already know the potential. Our grandparents and our parents have been through the worst of this. And so will there be any semblance of all the things that those generations work for? Will any of that still be here? And so it's, of course, sitting back and resting is necessary. But at the same time, there's going to be a point, I think, when we probably can't, because our own survival is on the line.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning the 92%. Before I get into the next question, it reminds me of the meme or the illustration that was going around where there were the Black women sitting on top of the building roof and all the world is on fire and it was 92%. And I'm like, yeah, I could sit there and watch the thing burn, but the fire will eventually come to my house. So I'm just like, how? Right. So I'm like, I'm proud to be of the 92%, but I'm also just like, how can I, utilize being of that moment to make something happen? Because of course we're all going to be impacted.
Yeah. What I'm concerned about is that in the similar ways to what happened, with George Floyd and how DEI exploded in terms of companies adopting DEI and universities after the murder of George Floyd, is how when the 92% step back in to the arena, how these other folks would try to use us to be cannon fodder, or to teach them how to fight back. And then we look back and like, hello, where y'all ain't got our back no more. So I'm always kind of juxtaposing, we got to get into the fight with being mindful of folks who have not been honest brokers and allies to us.
Oh, this is a great segue into the next question. Dr. Hampton's work in the California State University system served as a blueprint for Black women on board. Can you talk about how topics, and you kind of did a little bit of this, but if you could offer a little bit more, especially around education for public good, Black women's leadership, and educational activism, and how they emerge and evolve in the book?
Yeah, so in particularly education for the public good, I opened the book with a chapter called The Shifting Notions of the Public Good. And this is this idea that Black students, in particular in the 1960s, really wanted to expand this idea of education for the public good to mean more than just giving a whole bunch of people access from this financial standpoint, because that was the way we understood the public good or the public interest, was always, well, how do we spend responsibly? But Black students in particular, and students of the Third World Liberation Front and all of those groups, those activists, they were interested in saying, we want to expand who can come into the institution, who can benefit from that finance. And so they were the radicals that pressed the university to start to deal with affirmative action. I wanted to make sure that I uplifted their struggle, because what they did on the front lines of, the student strikes at San Francisco State and San Jose State and all across the country, what they did was they helped to change public opinion about access. Access should not just be limited to who can afford to come, who can afford to pay the tuition, but it should be expansive, that access is broader than that, because society benefits from the whole populace being educated, not just a select few. So in terms of education as a public good, it's student activists that really reframe that understanding. So it's not just rich white men that go to private institutions. In terms of educational activism, I've always thought that Claudia Hampton was acting and behaving like an activist. While even though she's in this, highly, conservative role, and she's got conservative dress, and the way she talks is very conservative, but she walked in, said, "I'm the affirmative action trustee." Like, she embraced that language. And it was her duty to defend affirmative action and to stand for it. And so I look at her as an activist, as opposed to just a board member who just happened to get on the board. She would say, and she had said, this was, serendipity, and, like kind of like a happenstance. But the way she conducted herself, she was very strategic. She would meet with the Black affirmative action officer, and they would strategize. She would cook dinner for the white men, and she would count votes and trade votes with them. And then she would go into board meetings and know she had counted her votes. And then when she became board chair, she would allow her allies to speak first, so everybody else had to play on the defense. So everything had an activist orientation, that she had a goal in mind, and she was going to get there either through collaboration with other people, or she was going to cook dinner for these folks and make them love her to the point where they would give her the money that she needed. What were some of the other
Yeah, Black women's leadership. That's definitely one that really, well, because of my identities, that really spoke to me in the book in terms of a topic.
Yeah, I mean, Black women employ a variety of different leadership styles. And I wanted, particularly in the 70s and 80s, historians treat African American history as if we just skip it. Like the 70s and 80s is just kind of like this postscript to the civil rights movement. It's like everything stops at like King's assassination. We might talk about the Black Panthers a little bit, but we ignore all of the activism that is happening in different types of realms. So you have Claudia Hampton, who is kind of a pragmatist. You have Elaine Brown and Erica Huggins in the Black Panther Party. They're using a Black radical tradition. You have Verna Canson, who is the West Coast director of the NAACP. She's going through the courts. You have Eva Patterson, who is this Black woman who also goes through the courts to protect affirmative action. You have on the other side of the country, you have, what's her name? Bertha Maxwell Roddy, who is using an approach that is called charismatic advocacy. So there's a range of ways in which Black women are using their institutions, community organizations, sororities, all kind of things in order to uplift and advance the community. But we don't talk about the 70s and 80s in any kind of meaningful way. Like, most people don't know who Johnny Tillman is and her work to advance the rights of women on working women who need welfare in order to survive. Though, or we talk about, Black women who were involved, and Puerto Rican women who were involved with the Young Lords Party, and the way they shifted that sexism within the Young Lords Party, the Puerto Rican activists, how they shifted that sexism kind of out with their platform work. So Black women have a type of leadership that, what is it? Belinkie call it a tradition that has no name. It's this kind of developmental leadership model where you learn how to be a leader in your own community before you get practical training on how to be a leader. Because if the street lights in your neighborhood don't work, or you don't have any books in your library, you got to fix this for the kids. And so you just practically learn how to become a leader. And you get that in your home life. You might get it through church or other organizations, but Black women do feminism. They don't need to profess it.
Yeah, you just remind me of like the things my mom did as an activist. Like, I'll never forget, I was having problems in school, and my mom was like, And she was on the PTO at the PTA at the time. She was like, "Nope, I'm gonna get a job." She ended up getting a part-time job at the school that I went to because she was like, "No one's listening to me. My child is having issues. What is going on?" And then like my dad, how he got involved, like including he was in charge of the carpool to work because a lot of the people that lived in our neighborhood, they all worked about a
Mhm.
45-minute drive away. Like just how local my parents got with their activism. And this is something that I tell my students. I'm like, they're like, well, will the things that we do count? And I'm like, sometimes you got to start from where you live. And
Yeah.
that is considered activism too. It's all about like sustainable impact. And the things that my parents did, that stuff lasted for a very long time, that type of
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. I remember students would ask me the same, have a similar kind of question. I said, well, in sociology, there's like three levels of kind of understanding yourself. So there's the micro level, there's the meso level, and then there's the macro level. Well, we're taught, the rugged individualism, it don't apply to us quite the same as it applies to other folks. But,
Yeah.
everybody's shooting for this macro level impact. I said, but where Black women in particular thrive is at the meso level, at the community level. Like how can their micro level, activity impact the community? And so it doesn't necessarily have to be to get onto the national stage. It could be to make sure that all the folks in the neighborhood have, after school care for their kids, or that they have clean drinking water and things like that.
Mhm. Yeah, and then I just have a couple more questions. And this is what happened with my mom. She ended up working in the school part time and saw all of these kids with all of these other issues. And so her activism took on a different form. So I love the whole lead from where you are.
Absolutely.
hmm so I want to segue a little bit into you as a writer. Um, I would love to know, especially given the lane that you straddle in academia. What are some advantages? And one of them you stated earlier about the access or lack thereof to the archives and how the art and what is available and how you actually lean into what's there. What are some
Mhm.
challenges and advantages of writing within the genres of history and politics? And then can you map out for us more about your approaches to working on such projects?
Yeah. So, the archive, you can enter the archive and there's nothing there or very little. And then you got to kind of piece things together. Or you can have on the other end, you can have a lot of one thing and not enough of another. I mean, there's a lot of different ways in which the archives can be your friend or your foe. Um, I was lucky. I had a virtually untapped archive. Like I opened pages and pages were kind of like tearing up when I was opening them because no one had gone through them. Um, and it but it ended up posing a challenge for me because there was no secondary literature on trusteeship. So I had to write, um, knowing that I could not rely on some secondary literature to help explain how political trusteeship is, because most of the books on trusteeship just tell you how to function as a trustee, like how to, how to go to meetings, and like it's very, very step one, transactional, but it doesn't give you, there wasn't any literature to give you a sense of how do I navigate race and gender? How do I negotiate with people from a different political strata? Like there was none of that. So I had to create that. Um, and so I had a good problem in that I had a complete intact archive, but I also had a problem when it was the first time a lot of this stuff would be kind of analyzed and evaluated. In terms of my own process, my process, um, I call it, and I've always used this. I don't just start writing. I actually do a lot of prep work before. And so I spent probably 2 years going through those archives and basically creating notes. I have probably like 200 pages of single space notes on just the archives from 1960 to 1994. And I actually donated my notes to the back to the archive to use it as to create a finding guide, because I had to create a system for zeroing in on affirmative action based issues in the archive. And then after I did a lot of that reading and note taking, COVID hit. And COVID created a whole another set of challenges because I couldn't keep going. But luckily, I had befriended the archivist and they gave me a lot of archive. Like they packed up the archive and we put it in my car. And they let me borrow it for the next 2 years. Uh, so I got lucky. I made friends. Um, and then I started to write. And how I wrote the whole thing chronologically. And then I went back and wrote the narrative. I wrote the analysis. And then, so I wanted to get on paper, like, let me make sure I got the whole story. The problem is I'm writing two stories within one. This is not a traditional biography. This is a story of how the Cal State system dealt with affirmative actions implementation. And it's a story about Claudia Hampton. And how do you weave those two things together? And I was struggling. And so I got some help from a developmental editor and to help me organize this. And so for the first two chapters, it is chronology. But for the next few chapters, we went thematic. So then that way I could tell the story of how the Cal State system up to a certain point dealt with affirmative action, and then thematically talk about how Claudia Hampton built soft power and then enacted that soft power. And it was a challenge not writing it straight chronology. The historian in me just was like, once upon a time, the end. But in between there, because I have to tell a federal story, a state story, and a local story, kind of all simultaneously. And so to keep track of that, I needed to go thematic.
Given the current political, social, and policymaking climate, how do you see this book being used at this time? Or how is this book being used at this time? And then what is the next life for Black women on board?
Yeah, so when the book came out last year and I had, doing the promo for it and talking about it, I didn't imagine that I would start to get requests for how to teach people about SLIDE civility, how to enact it in the workplace. But that's the new life that this is kind of taken on. And I think why it's happening at this moment is because folks are really concerned about, the dismantling of DEI and, all of the people losing funding for their various types of programs and projects. And, so how do you court donors so that you can keep doing your work? And SLIDE Civility provides you with a vehicle by which to do that. How do you develop soft power? And then how do you enact that soft power? So I've been doing workshops with agencies that I would think no one would be interested in this book on this Black woman and as a trustee. But last month I did a workshop with a group of STEM teachers, a nonprofit that helps to encourage people to become STEM teachers from industry. And so I'm teaching them how to kind of move from industry to education, but use SLIDE civility to make sure they can help advocate for their students. So now I'm instead of talking about the book explicitly, I'm more talking about how Claudia Hampton enacted this type of leadership style. And I don't I don't remember if it was me or the developmental editor who kind of came up with this idea. I think it was me, but my memory is is going. But I decided with chapters 3 and 4 to write it almost like a manual, where I have a strategy, I define the strategy, and then I give you the historic vignettes that where you see what Claudia Hampton did. Because Homie Baba does not delineate all the strategies. He just coined the phrase slide civility. I went through all of the different types of scenarios that where Claudia Hampton had to enact it, and then I gave it a strategy name. So I wanted the book to be historical, of course, and tell this narrative and tell this story, but I also wanted it to be practical, that people could use it, because I ended up starting to use some of these same strategies in my work as a department chair, and now as an administrator. Now I use those strategies in how I interact with various levels of higher education.
Wow. And that is, ooh. Which
Yeah.
at some institutions where I'll say I've interacted with, because I don't want to out
Mhm.
folks, whenever the department chair position comes open, nobody wants it. No one
Mhm.
wants it.
Yeah. And it's crazy because I tell people I actually enjoyed being a department chair, but it was because I felt like I was equipped with the ability to negotiate with people, because I learned a lot of this from Claudia Hampton. I say in the book, I give some examples of how I had a donor who bold-faced told me, I don't think that Africana studies or Black studies is a viable academic field. And I'm sitting here like, whoa, yeah, how do I not cuss her out? Because because the kids need the money, for the scholarships and the research opportunities. And I mean, in a split second, it was like, remember Claudia Hampton? And I was like, okay, all right, all right. So I explained, like I kind of gently said, um, no, I disagree with that, and let me tell you why. And then, fortunately, this woman who was a friend of Claudia Hampton was standing next to me when all of this was going down, and I pivoted to her. I said, "Didn't you know Claudia Hampton? Wasn't she your sorority sister?" She's like, "Oh yes, I worked with her." Blah 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 blah. And so, because this woman, when I was talking about Claudia Hampton, because she asked me about my research, and I said, I'm working on this book. And I said, when she first got there, someone called her the N word, like really early on in, like, I think it was her first year. It's like, oh, there's N word in the wood pile kind of thing. And this person who's Black told me, well, I don't want you to assume that just because she's Black, she had a hard time. And I was like, I'm literally telling you, she was called out of her name. And so, the Black radical tradition in me would have been like, look, but the department chair who had to keep my students and their needs at the forefront relied on Claudia Hampton to I channeled that in order to be successful, and we were able to get the funding and keep this program going. If I hadn't encountered Claudia Hampton, no telling what I would have said to somebody like that.
You would have slashed tires. You would have met them outside.
Like, what did you say? Like, for real? But yeah, I mean, and so as I got more comfortable in kind of using slide civility myself, I started to see that, with the chairing position, I could enact change, policy changes, and things like that. And so now that I'm an administrator, when I walked into this role as associate dean, I said, I want to cut as much bureaucratic red tape so that we can make sure we have enough opportunities available for faculty to do good work, to hire the best faculty, and to make sure our students have enriched, diverse experiences. Well, I couldn't do that if I went in and said, well, y'all ain't hired a Black person in, because I am the first Black person in senior leadership in this college. Now, if I walked in there and just started, wagging my finger at folks, do you think I would be in that position? Probably not. So, the thing about SLY civility that I do want to point out is that SLY civility it's not about just your personal enrichment. It's about how you help your community. And that's different than, people just trying to climb to the top. I really believe that what I'm trying to do and what Claudia Hampton tried to do is to make sure we have space for more Black folks, for more women, to help our community as a whole. And without, let me give you just a really, really quick example. In California, we have a requirement the students take ethnic studies courses to graduate. Every so often, a student will try to petition, said, "Oh, I took a class and they had diversity written into the description, and they want to get credit for it so they don't have to take this ethnic studies class." Well, as the chief curriculum officer for the college, I certify these things, and because I know the field and have been in the field, I can say yes or no, and so I can make sure that people don't say simply because you had 1 week of Sojourner Truth that now this is a diversity class that like, no, sweetie, you're gonna have to take that ethnic studies course, because people think that ethnic studies is not a real discipline or a real field until you have someone like myself being able to be the kind of, if you can call it gatekeeper, the gatekeeper to make sure you respect the field.
And lastly, what is next for you, and how can a Black Writers Read community support you on this journey?
Yeah, so really, it's a couple things. I probably got too many projects. Let's see, how do I say this? I'm working on some fiction. I'm trying to finish a book that I started many, many years ago. It's a historical fiction. It's about it's placed in World War II in the Philippines, with the dark-skinned Filipinos that the Spanish called the Negritos, but they're called the Ata. They're indigenous. And so I want to finish that project because it's been sitting. And I kept saying, well, when I get this book done, I'll get it done. Well, I want to finish that. I also am working on a book on conservative philanthropy and race, which is a longer project for the work that I've done. I've been an opinion writer for Al Jazeera. And so I am, and so it's an extension of that work that looks at how conservatives put money into education, in particular, starting from 1945, to get rid of ethnic studies programs, multicultural affairs programs, gender studies programs. And I've been writing about this stuff for quite some time, but now it's a book length project. I don't know in this current moment how, these things bring out trolls, so I got to think about it. And then the last project that I'm working on is a thing called a public scholar. It's a like a toolkit for people to become public scholars, particularly folks who are at community colleges and comprehensive regional institutions, because we don't get a lot of mentoring on how to promote your book, on how to write opinion columns, how to write research reports. We don't get a lot of help and support with that. The R1s do, but our institutions don't, because we're teaching based. And I think we want to get our scholarship out there. And because our scholarship can be used to change people's lives. It should not just sit on a shelf in, on a bookshelf or in a journal article.
I am so excited about that project because that was kind of like excuse me, some of the issues that I had when I was first going for my doctorate, where because my work really straddled in like community based work, people were like literally schools rejected me because they were like, we don't know where to put you because you want to do like center the eye in a unique way and like position subjectivity in a unique way. And I was just like, oh my God. And I feel like the public scholar work that you're doing is really going to open that up a lot more for a
Yeah.
lot of, well, I'm now done, but like for students who were like me, who were struggling with, okay, I want to do like, I want to write books that exist and straddle in multiple spaces, but it speaks to like practicality, like what
Yeah.
can people do to actually adapt the work as opposed to just talking about it and thinking critically about it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like I was one of the co-authors of the State of Black Los Angeles County report. And you would think, well, how did a historian get on there? But you need to contextualize why in 2023, that's when the report came out, why Black people are at the bottom of every metric except for like one or two in the county. Well, you need a historical context before you get into the data. And so I could help unpack the data from a historical lens. And so I could take those skills that I have and get that information out to people so that now we can think about some policy change. But if we continue to just publish articles and books without thinking through, well, what could be the next iteration of this? And that was how I approached this book, was how can we use her strategies, not just know about them? How can we use them? And so that's why I wrote in such a way where it looks like a manual. Somebody told me, it's like, this kind of reads like a manual, except it's a manual that's grounded in history. And I was like, yeah, you can do both.
Yeah, Dr. Nicol, thank you so much for starting, given the time difference, starting your afternoon with us today.
Oh, absolutely. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, so I'm gonna wrap us up, and I'll check in with you before we have our days back.
Okay.
Thank you. So thank you all for joining us for episode 17 of season 5 of Black Writers Read. I'll be back next week. Please be sure to follow me on social media, Black Writers Read, for the announcement of next week's guest. Support Black Writers Read by subscribing to my YouTube channel, where many of you are joining us from today, or the audio podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts, iHeart, Spotify, and Amazon Music. Also, feel free to drop a review of the Black Writers Read podcast on one of these platforms. By supporting me as a subscriber or reviewer, you're growing our community, which can lead to longer-term sustainability. Visit blackwritersread.com to learn more about the podcast. And also, thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and more importantly, for ensuring that Black authors continue to matter. I will see you next week.